You're listening to In God We, a modern parable of redemption, by Lil Baby Jesus, Jennifer Crabtree. Narrated by Garen Patrick. We hope you enjoy. Chapter 1. The Weight of Words. Part 1. The Paper. The paper was ordinary. Marcus Ellison held it between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the slight texture of standard office stock. 20-pound weight, probably recycled, the kind that comes in reams of 500 and costs less than a cup of coffee. Too thin to matter, too plain to be feared. The fluorescent lights of the Office of Public Records hummed overhead, casting that particular shade of institutional white that made everything look slightly jaundiced, slightly unreal. What unsettled Registrar Patricia Chen was not what the paper said, but what it did not. She had worked in this building for 17 years of processing birth certificates, death certificates, business licenses, tax liens, property deeds, the endless documentation of human existence translated into administrative language. She had developed, over nearly 2 decades, an instinct for irregularity, a sixth sense for the documents that would cause trouble, the misspelled names that would require correction, the incomplete forms that would bounce back, the fraudulent claims that would need investigation. This document triggered none of those alarms, and that was precisely what troubled her. There was no demand written there, no claim of ownership, no request for authority or jurisdiction or legal standing. No reference to statute or code or precedent, only a phrase, unfinished, almost careless in its brevity, written in neat block letters with what appeared to be a simple ballpoint pen. In God We, that was all. No period, no continuation, just those 3 words floating on the page like a question that had forgotten how to end itself. Patricia read it twice. On the 3rd reading, she slowed, her eyes tracing each letter, as if the meaning might reveal itself through repetition. The phrase did not accuse, it did not instruct, it did not demand or plead or argue. It simply rested on the page, as though it had been waiting longer than the building itself, longer than the city, longer than the entire apparatus of documentation and registration and official recognition that gave her job meaning. "Is there a continuation?" she asked, keeping her voice professionally neutral, though her hands had begun to perspire slightly against the paper. "There never was," the man replied. His voice was quiet, not meek. There was a quality to it that suggested depths she couldn't quite measure, but genuinely soft, as though he were accustomed to speaking in spaces where volume was unnecessary, where words carried their own weight without needing to be forced. Patricia looked up at him for the first time since he'd handed her the document. Marcus Ellison didn't look like someone who would file an incomplete registration. He didn't look like someone who would file anything at all, frankly. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, though something in his eyes suggested he'd lived considerably longer. He wore clothes that were clean but worn, jeans that had faded naturally over time, a simple gray t-shirt under a jacket that had seen better days, work boots that had been resoled at least once. His hands were calloused, working hands, honest hands, but it was his eyes that caught her. They held something she'd only seen a few times in her career, in people who'd survived things that should have destroyed them. Veterans, sometimes, refugees, parents who'd lost children, people who'd been to the edge of whatever humans could endure and had somehow, inexplicably, found their way back. Not broken, mended. There was a difference. "Sir," Patricia began, falling back on procedure because procedure was safe. Procedure was knowable. "I need to understand what you're registering. The document type, the legal purpose, the—" I'm not registering anything," Marcus interrupted gently. "I'm recording something." "Recording what?" "A truth." The word hung in the air between them like a foreign object. In the Office of Public Records, truth was not a category. Facts were a category. Claims were a category. Assertions, declarations, certifications, all of these had forms, had fields, had proper procedures. But truth? Truth was philosophical. Truth was subjective. Truth was not something you filed in triplicate. Patricia felt a headache beginning to form behind her right eye, the kind she got when people tried to submit documents that didn't fit the system. The anarchists who refused to acknowledge authority, the sovereign citizens with their incomprehensible legal theories, the conspiracy theorists who insisted on filing complaints about chemtrails and mind control. But this man wasn't any of those things. She could tell. "Mr. Ellison," she said, reading his name from the header on the page, "I appreciate that you feel strongly about whatever this is, but I can't process a document that doesn't specify its legal purpose or claim. There's no box for truth. There's no statute that allows for recording statements of personal belief. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Marcus nodded. "I do, but I'm not making a personal statement. I'm making a record for when it's needed." "When what's needed?" "Completion." Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was something in the way he said that word, completion, that made her deeply uncomfortable, as if he knew something she didn't, as if he was seeing 3 moves ahead in a game she hadn't realized they were playing. She glanced down at the document again. "In God we," 3 words, 26 letters, infinite implications. "I'm going to need to consult with my supervisor," she said finally. Marcus simply nodded and took a seat in one of the plastic chairs along the wall, the kind designed to be just uncomfortable enough to discourage lingering. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his breathing slow and even, as if he had all the time in the world, as if time itself was waiting for him. Part 2. The Consultation. Supervisor Gerald Hammond had been managing the Office of Public Records for 23 years. He had seen it all, or so he liked to believe. When Patricia knocked on his door, he was reviewing budget allocations for the next fiscal quarter, a mind-numbing experience that involved justifying why human beings were still necessary in an age when most registration could be done online. It was the kind of work that slowly eroded the soul, one spreadsheet cell at a time. "Come in," he called, grateful for any interruption. Patricia entered with the paper held in front of her like a contaminated specimen. "We have a situation." Gerald sat up straighter. In the Office of Public Records, situations were rare. Problems were common. Missed deadlines, lost files, computer crashes. But situations implied something that didn't fit into existing categories. "What kind of situation?" She placed the paper on his desk without a word. Gerald looked down at it, adjusted his reading glasses, and read the 3 words. Then he looked up at Patricia, then back down at the paper, then back up at Patricia. "Is this a joke?" "I don't think so. Who filed this?" "Marcus Ellison. He's waiting in the lobby." Gerald read the document again, slower this time, searching for hidden meaning or coded language or some indication of intent. He found none. Just 3 words, incomplete, waiting. What does he want? "He says he wants to record a truth for when it's needed." "For when what's needed?" "Completion." Gerald felt that same flicker of unease that Patricia had experienced, a sense that There was a larger context he was missing, a framework of understanding that existed just outside his peripheral vision. He had worked in public administration long enough to know that the system ran on certainty, on clear categories and defined procedures, on the principle that everything could be classified, filed, indexed, and retrieved according to established protocols. This document threatened that certainty, not through aggression or defiance, but through its very incompleteness. It created a gap in the system, a space that couldn't be filled according to existing rules, but that the system would nevertheless attempt to absorb. And absorption, in bureaucratic terms, was acceptance. "What do you want me to do?" Patricia asked. Gerald leaned back in his chair, which creaked in that particular way that government furniture does when it's been supporting the weight of difficult decisions for too many years. "Did he sign it?" "No signature, just his name typed at the bottom." "No notarization?" "No." "No reference to any legal authority?" "None." "No requested action?" "No." Gerald drummed his fingers on his desk, an old habit from his years as a claims adjuster, back before he descended to the relative safety of management. He was trying to think like the system, trying to find a category that would contain this anomaly. But every category he considered rejected the document. It wasn't a claim because it made no assertion of right. It wasn't a complaint because it identified no grievance. It wasn't a request because it asked for nothing. It wasn't a declaration because it declared nothing specific. It was simply there, existing, waiting to be acknowledged. "What statute is he invoking?" Gerald asked, grasping at procedural straws. "He isn't. I asked him about legal basis. He said he wasn't making a legal claim. He was making a record." "A record of what?" "A truth." There was that word again, truth. The word that had no place in administrative documents because it couldn't be verified, couldn't be measured, couldn't be indexed according to the Dewey Decimal System or the Library of Congress classification or any other organizational principle that gave order to chaos. Gerald picked up the paper, holding it to the light as if transparency might reveal hidden watermarks or secret messages. He saw only standard office paper, slightly translucent, with the faint impression of the ballpoint pen that had pressed those 3 words into existence. "In God we." "Has he caused any disruption?" Gerald asked. "No, he's sitting quietly in the lobby. Very polite, very patient." "Mental illness?" Patricia shook her head. "He doesn't present that way. He's lucid, coherent, calm, just certain." Certainty, another dangerous quality in the realm of public administration, where everything was provisional, subject to review, liable to change pending further documentation. Gerald made a decision. It was the kind of decision that administrators make when faced with problems that don't fit the manual, the decision to not decide, to defer, to file and observe, to let time and bureaucratic inertia work their slow magic. "Process it," he said. Patricia blinked. "Process it as what?" "As a general filing, no specific category. Just create a file number, date stamp it, and give him a receipt. Put it in pending review." "For how long?" "Indefinitely." It was a brilliant bureaucratic maneuver, really. By accepting the document without categorizing it, the system acknowledged its existence without granting it meaning. By placing it in pending review, they avoided the appearance of rejection while ensuring it would never actually be reviewed. By giving it a file number, they made it trackable while ensuring it would never be tracked. The document would enter the system and immediately become lost in it, one piece of paper among millions, floating in the vast ocean of public records, technically present but functionally invisible. Perfect. Patricia hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, what if this becomes something?" Gerald looked up at her, his expression tired. "Everything becomes something, eventually. That's the nature of records. We just file them and wait." Part 3. The Man Who Knew Suffering. Marcus Ellison waited. He was good at waiting. 23 years in the system had taught him that. First in foster care, then juvenile detention, then county jail, then the state penitentiary, where he'd served 8 years for a crime he'd committed in desperation and stupidity when he was 19 years old. 8 years. He'd gone in a boy and come out something else, not quite a man, and not the kind of man his mother had prayed he'd become before she died of cancer when he was 12, leaving him alone in a world that didn't give a damn about black boys with no family and no money, and no options except the streets. The streets had taught him the first lesson: survive. The system had taught him the second: endure. But it was God who had taught him the third lesson, the one that changed everything: witness. Marcus shifted in the uncomfortable plastic chair and felt the familiar ache in his lower back, a souvenir from a beating he'd taken in Folsom when he was 23. 3 men had jumped him in the yard over some perceived disrespect that Marcus still didn't understand. They'd broken 2 ribs and cracked a vertebra. The prison doctor had prescribed ibuprofen and told him to walk it off. That was the night Marcus first prayed. Not the casual prayers of childhood, the rote recitations his mother had made him memorize before bed, and not the desperate bargaining prayers he'd whispered in the back of the police cruiser when he was 19, promising God he'd change if he'd just make this all go away. Real prayer, the kind that came from a place deeper than words, deeper than thought, deeper than the broken body lying on a concrete floor in a cell that smelled like industrial cleaner and human despair. He had cried out to God with everything he had left, and God had answered. Not with a miracle, not with angels or voices or blinding light. God had answered with silence. But a different kind of silence than Marcus had known before. A silence that felt like presence, like being seen, like being known. In that silence, Marcus had understood something that would take him years to articulate. Suffering was not punishment. Suffering was preparation. Over the next 5 years in prison, Marcus had changed, not because of programs or rehabilitation or therapy, though he'd participated in all of those dutifully, playing the game that the parole board wanted to see. He'd changed because every morning when he woke up, he asked God one question: "What do you want me to see today?" And every day, God showed him. He saw the young kid, barely 18, who came in terrified and was being groomed by the gangs. Marcus had pulled him aside, taught him how to move, how to speak, how to survive without selling his soul or his body. The kid made it out after 2 years, clean. Last Marcus heard, he was working construction in Oakland, married, had a daughter. He saw the old man, 67, dying of hepatitis C, in a system that couldn't afford treatment. Marcus had sat with him in the infirmary every day for 3 months, reading to him from the Bible, not preaching, just reading. The man died holding Marcus's hand, whispering thank you. He saw the guard, young and angry, who was taking his divorce out on the inmates, looking for excuses to write people up, to put them in solitary. Marcus had watched him for weeks, had seen the pain underneath the rage. One day, Marcus had simply asked him, "You good, boss?" The guard had frozen, then walked away. 2 weeks later, he'd pulled Marcus aside and asked him how he stayed sane in this place. They'd talked for an hour. The guard quit 6 months later, went back to school, became a social worker. Marcus saw people, really saw them, not as obstacles or opportunities or threats, but as human beings carrying burdens he couldn't see, fighting battles he didn't know about, crying out for something they couldn't name. And whenever he saw them clearly, something in him responded, not with pity, but with recognition. Because he knew what it was to be unseen. He knew what it was to be reduced to a number, a statistic, a category in someone else's filing system. He knew what it was to be accounted for without being counted. When Marcus was released at 32, he walked out of Folsom with $200 gate money, a bag of property that contained nothing he wanted to keep, and a vision that had come to him in prayer 3 nights before. Not a dream, a vision. He had seen a city, this city, and in it he had seen systems within systems, structures built on structures, all of them measuring and counting and categorizing and filing, all of them turning human lives into data points, all of them operating on a fundamental assumption that Marcus now understood was a lie, that value could be measured. The vision had shown him something else, 2 metals, intertwined but distinct, silver and gold. Silver circulating endlessly, counting and recounting, measuring and remeasuring, accumulating and distributing according to laws that seemed immutable but were actually arbitrary. And gold, still and deep, the foundation that silver had forgotten it rested on. Gold that didn't circulate because it didn't need to. Gold that didn't prove its worth because its worth was inherent. Gold that existed not to be spent, but to be acknowledged. In the vision, Marcus had seen himself standing in a building made entirely of silver, a building that gleamed and functioned and processed and produced, and in his hand he held a single piece of paper, 3 words written on it, "In God we." The vision had ended there, with those 3 words incomplete, hanging in the air like a question. Marcus had woken up knowing what he had to do. Part 4. The City of Silver. The city had changed in the 8 years Marcus was away, but not in ways that mattered. The buildings were taller, the cars were newer, the technology was faster, but the fundamental reality remained the same. People were measured by what they had, not by who they were. Marcus had found work quickly, construction, under the table, cash paid daily. The foreman didn't care about his record as long as he showed up on time and worked hard. Marcus did both. He was strong despite the back pain. He was reliable despite having no address. He was good with his hands despite the scars on his knuckles from fights he'd tried to forget. He lived in a rooming house on the east side, the kind of place where nobody asked questions, as long as you paid your $300 a week in cash. His room was 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single bed, a hot plate, and a bathroom down the hall that he shared with 5 other men. The walls were thin enough that he could hear everything. Arguments, television, intimate moments, nightmares. He heard the city breathing. At night, Marcus would lie on the thin mattress and pray, not for comfort or success or prosperity, the prayers that the megachurch preachers on TV promised would unlock God's blessings if you just had enough faith and sent enough money. He prayed for vision, for understanding, for the ability to see what God was doing in a world that seemed designed to hide God's presence. And in those prayers, revelation came. Not all at once, not in complete sentences or systematic theology, but in fragments, in insights, in moments of clarity that would hit him while he was hauling drywall or eating a sandwich on a lunch break, or walking home through streets where human beings slept on sidewalks while restaurants threw away food. He began to understand the silver and the gold. Silver was the measure of man. It counted labor and time and productivity. It assigned value based on utility. It flowed through the city like blood through a body, keeping everything moving, enabling exchange, facilitating survival. Silver was necessary, but silver was not sufficient, because silver could only count what it could see, and most of what mattered in human life was invisible to silver's accounting. Love, sacrifice, dignity, honor, faithfulness, patience, kindness, mercy. These things had no silver value because they couldn't be extracted, couldn't be sold, couldn't be measured in units that silver recognized. But they had gold value. Gold was the measure of God. Gold didn't circulate because it wasn't meant to. Gold anchored, gold endured. Gold held its worth, not because of what it could do, but because of what it was. And human beings, Marcus came to understand, were made in the image of gold, not in the image of silver, though silver tried to claim them, tried to reduce them to their productivity, their consumption, their utility to the system. In the image of gold, inherently valuable, immeasurably precious, complete in their existence, regardless of function. This was the revelation that had been given to him in prayer, in suffering, in the long hours of silence, when God spoke not in words, but in knowing. Part 4. The Ratio. Marcus had been working construction for 6 months when he met James Carter. James was a law student at the State University, working as a paralegal at a legal aid clinic to pay his tuition. He was bright, idealistic, and burning with the kind of righteous anger that came from seeing injustice up close for the first time. They met at a community center where Marcus sometimes volunteered, teaching basic literacy to men coming out of prison. James had come to do a Know Your Rights presentation. Afterward, they'd grabbed coffee at the diner down the street, the kind of place where the coffee was weak and the pie was good, and the waitress called everyone honey. "You did time?" James asked, direct but not unkind. 8 years, Folsom. Marcus didn't elaborate. He never did, unless asked. "What for?" "Armed robbery. I was 19, stupid, and desperate. A man got hurt. I got caught, did my time." James nodded, processing. "You seem different than most guys I've met coming out." "How so?" "You're peaceful. Most guys are angry, bitter. You're not." Marcus stirred sugar into his coffee, watching the crystals dissolve. "I was angry for about 3 years. Then I realized anger was just another way of letting the system own me. So I let it go." "Just like that?" "No, not just like that. Took another 2 years and a lot of prayer." James leaned forward. "You religious?" "I'm faithful," Marcus corrected gently. "There's a difference." Over the next hour, Marcus had shared pieces of his story. Not all of it, but enough. The vision, the revelation about silver and gold, the understanding that had come to him about how the world measured value. James listened with the intensity of someone encountering an idea that reorganized everything he thought he knew. "Have you read Corpus Juris Secundum?" James asked suddenly. Marcus shook his head. "What's that?" "It's an encyclopedia of U.S. law, one of the foundational texts, and there's something in there that what you're saying reminds me of." James pulled out his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Here, section on money and legal tender." He turned the screen so Marcus could see. The text was dense, written in that particular legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But Marcus read it carefully, his lips moving slightly as he parsed the meaning. There it was, the distinction between lawful money and legal tender, between gold-backed currency and fiat currency, between value intrinsic and value declared. "You see it?" James asked. "Yeah," Marcus said slowly. "I see it." The law itself encoded the truth he'd been shown. Silver was legal tender, backed by nothing but the declaration that it had value. It circulated on faith, on agreement, on collective delusion. But gold? Gold was lawful money. Its value didn't depend on declaration. It existed independent of the system that tried to measure it. "There's more," James continued, clicking to another section. "The ratio, 70 parts silver to 30 parts gold. It's in the old bimetallic standards, the ancient weights and measures, 70-30. Marcus felt something click into place, a final piece of understanding settling into position. 70% of human value could be measured in silver terms. Labor, time, productivity, skill, output, these things could be counted, compensated, exchanged. But 30%, the gold, could never be measured, could never be compensated, could never be exchanged. That 30% was the image of God in man, the part that loved without expecting return, the part that sacrificed without demanding recognition, the part that created beauty for its own sake, the part that forgave without requiring restitution, the part that existed simply because it was, not because of what it could do. The system, the silver system, tried to account for that 30%, tried to measure it, quantify it, assign it value, but every time it tried, the measurement failed, the value escaped. The gold slipped through silver's fingers like water through a net, because gold couldn't be counted. It could only be acknowledged. Part 6. The Filing. It had taken Marcus another 6 months to understand what he was supposed to do with this revelation. He'd prayed, he'd studied, he'd read the laws James had shown him, working through the dense legal language late into the night, using a dictionary he'd bought at a thrift store for $2. He'd read the Bible differently now, not as a collection of moral tales or theological propositions, but as a record of God's relationship with humanity. As a ledger of divine accounting that operated on principles completely different from human systems. The covenant with Abraham, I will make you a great nation, not because Abraham earned it, not because he was productive or useful or particularly righteous, but because God chose to acknowledge him, to see him, to count him as righteous through faith alone. The covenant with Isaac, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant, inherited, not earned, passed down not through merit, but through lineage, through blood, through the gold of identity. The covenant with Jacob, your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, innumerable, uncountable, exceeding any system's ability to measure. Marcus saw it all now. Saw how the entire biblical narrative was the story of God trying to teach humanity that their value didn't come from what they produced or achieved or accumulated. Their value came from being seen by God, from being counted in God's economy, from being accounted for in the ledger that mattered. And one night, in prayer, Marcus had received the final piece. Record it, not preach it. Marcus wasn't a preacher, not organize it into a movement. Marcus had no interest in power or followers, not even explain it fully. Just record it, put it into the system, let the system receive it, let the acknowledgement become part of the public record. Because once it was recorded, it can never be erased. Even if it was ignored, forgotten, buried under millions of other documents, it would still exist, still wait, still hold its place in the archive of human history. In God we, 3 words, incomplete, waiting for the world to finish the sentence. So Marcus had come to this building on a Tuesday morning in October, carrying a single piece of paper and a truth that he knew the system couldn't contain, but would nevertheless have to accept. He'd handed it to the registrar, and now he waited. Waited for the bureaucracy to do what bureaucracies always did. Absorb, process, file, forget. But Marcus wasn't worried, because God had shown him that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance was simply to exist, to be present, to be counted, even when the system didn't know how to count you. To be a grain of sand in the gears of silver, reminding the machine that gold existed. Part 7. The Receipt. Patricia emerged from her supervisor's office holding a file folder and a receipt form. Her expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd been given instructions they didn't fully understand, but were required to follow. Marcus stood as she approached. "Mr. Ellison," she said formally, "we're processing your filing. You'll need to sign here to acknowledge receipt." She handed him a form. Marcus read it carefully. It was standard bureaucratic language, confirming that he had submitted a document on this date, that it had been received and would be processed according to established protocols, that he understood it might be subject to review or rejection. Standard, except for one line. "This filing is received without prejudice and does not constitute acceptance of any claims, explicit or implicit." Marcus signed. His signature was simple, legible, the signature of a man who'd learned to write clearly in environments where unclear communication could get you killed. Patricia handed him a yellow copy. "Your file number is RF 2024-10847. Keep this for your records." "Thank you," Marcus said. She hesitated, then asked the question she knew she shouldn't. "Mr. Ellison, what are you hoping to accomplish with this?" Marcus looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the fatigue around her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders that came from 17 years of processing human lives into administrative categories. He saw the wedding ring she still wore, even though he could tell from the tan line that it was a size too big now, that she'd lost weight, probably from stress. He saw the cross on a chain around her neck, tucked under her blouse where it wouldn't violate the office's unspoken dress code. He saw her. "I'm not hoping to accomplish anything," he said gently. "I'm bearing witness. That's all any of us can do." Something flickered in her eyes, recognition maybe, or longing, or the memory of a faith she'd once held more tightly. "To what?" she asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "To the truth that the system can't measure." Patricia nodded slowly, not quite understanding, but sensing something important had just passed between them. She handed him the original document back. "You should keep this too. The copy in the file is sufficient." Marcus took it, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. As he walked toward the exit, Patricia called after him. "Mr. Ellison?" He turned. "Good luck." He smiled, a real smile, the kind that lit up his whole face, despite the scars and the premature age. "I don't need luck, ma'am, but I appreciate the blessing." And then he was gone, through the double doors, into the October sunlight that slanted through the buildings at an angle that made the whole city look like it was made of silver and gold. Part 8. The Seed Planted. Patricia stood in the lobby for a long moment after Marcus left, staring at the doors as if she could still see his silhouette imprinted on the glass. Then she walked slowly back to her desk, sat down, and opened the file she'd created. RF 2024-10847. She stared at it. According to procedure, she should categorize it, assign it keywords for indexing, tag it for review or disposal, according to retention schedules. But every category she considered felt wrong. This wasn't a business filing. It wasn't a vital record. It wasn't a legal claim or a complaint or petition. It was... she didn't know what it was. Patricia typed "pending review" uncategorized into the status field and closed the file. That night, she went home to her empty apartment, the apartment that had felt too large ever since Michael left, taking half the furniture and all of the warmth, and she pulled out the Bible her grandmother had given her when she was confirmed at 12. She hadn't opened it in years. The leather cover was soft with age, the pages thin and delicate. She flipped through randomly, not looking for anything specific, just seeking. The book fell open to Matthew 13, the parable of the sower. Patricia read about the seed that fell on different types of soil, about the seed that fell on good soil and produced a crop, 30, 60, or 100 times what was sown. She stopped, read it again. 30, 60, or 100 times. 30. She thought about Marcus Ellison and his incomplete sentence, and his talk of things the system couldn't measure. She thought about the cross she wore, hidden under her blouse, the faith she'd let atrophy under the weight of forms and protocols and 17 years of reducing human lives to data. She thought about the seed, and for the first time in years, Patricia Chen prayed. Not a formal prayer, not a memorized recitation, just 3 words whispered into the silence of her living room. I am listening. Part 9. The Silver Council. 3,000 miles away, in a conference room on the 47th floor of a building that scraped the sky and reflected it back in sheets of tinted glass, men and women gathered around a table made of black granite, shot through with veins of silver. They were the architects of liquidity, the custodians of capital, the high priests of the silver economy. They did not know about Marcus Ellison. They did not know about RF 2024-10847. But they were about to feel its effects. The quarterly meeting of the Federal Reserve's Open Market Committee always followed the same pattern. Reports on inflation, employment, GDP growth, monetary velocity. Discussions of interest rates, quantitative easing, reserve requirements. Decisions that would ripple through the global economy, affecting billions of lives in ways both subtle and profound. Silver measuring silver, adjusting the flow, maintaining the illusion of control. Janet Reeves, the committee's newest member, listened to the presentations with growing unease. The numbers all made sense, the models all functioned, the projections all fell within acceptable parameters. But something felt wrong. She'd been an economist for 23 years, had published papers on monetary theory that were cited in textbooks, had advised 3 administrations on fiscal policy. She understood money, or thought she did, the way a mechanic understood engines or a surgeon understood anatomy. But lately she'd been having doubts. The doubts had started small, a nagging sense that the models they used to predict economic behavior were missing something fundamental, that human beings weren't really rational actors maximizing utility, that markets weren't really efficient processors of information, that money itself was, a shared hallucination, a mass delusion, a story everyone agreed to believe because the alternative was chaos? The doubts had grown. She'd started reading history, real history, not the sanitized economic histories that treated depressions as data points and recessions as statistical aberrations. She'd read about the bank runs of the 1930s, when people realized that money in the bank was just a promise, not a thing. About the hyperinflation in Weimar Germany, when money became so abundant it was worthless. About the Dutch tulip mania, when a single bulb sold for more than a house because everyone believed it would. She'd read about the ancient world, about Rome debasing its currency by adding more base metals to the silver, stretching it thinner and thinner until the coins contained almost no silver at all, but everyone still pretended they did. She'd read about gold, how for thousands of years across every culture, gold had held value, not because governments declared it or markets discovered it, but because something in the human soul recognized it as real, in a way that silver never could be. Gold didn't circulate well. Gold was heavy, impractical, hard to divide. Silver was better for trade, better for daily transactions, better for keeping the economy moving. But gold was what you held when everything else failed. Gold was the anchor when the silver system collapsed, as it always eventually did. Dr. Reeves? Janet snapped back to attention. The chairman was looking at her expectantly. I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? Your assessment of the current reserve ratios, are they sustainable? Janet looked down at the report in front of her. Columns of numbers, ratios, percentages, the mathematics of confidence. Mathematically, yes, she said slowly. But? She shouldn't say it. She was the newest member of the committee. She was here on her expertise, yes, but also on her willingness to play ball, to not rock the boat, to understand that some truths were better left unspoken. But she said it anyway. But we're measuring confidence, not value. And confidence is based on belief, not reality. We're asking people to have faith in a system that explicitly denies the possibility of faith-based value. Silence around the table. The chairman frowned. I'm not sure I follow. Janet took a breath. Silver measures what circulates. But circulation requires trust. A trust that what you receive today will have value tomorrow. That's faith, not mathematics. We've built an entire monetary system on the foundation of faith, while simultaneously denying that faith has any economic validity. Are you suggesting we return to the gold standard? Someone asked, their tone making clear how absurd they found the idea. No, Janet said. I'm suggesting we acknowledge what we're actually doing. We're priests administering a sacrament we don't believe in, using rituals we don't understand to people who've lost faith in the whole enterprise, and we wonder why it's failing. More silence. The chairman cleared his throat. I think we should table this discussion and move to the next agenda item. Janet nodded and fell silent, but the seed had been planted. That night, alone in her hotel room, Janet opened her laptop and typed a search query she would never have considered 6 months ago. Gold standard biblical covenant ratios. The results were sparse, eccentric, mostly from religious websites she would normally dismiss as fringe, but one caught her attention. A paper titled 70-30, The Divine Ratio in Ancient Weights and Measures. She downloaded it, read it, and felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Part 10. The Follower. James Carter couldn't stop thinking about Marcus Ellison. It had been 3 weeks since their conversation at the diner, and James had spent most of that time diving deep into research that had nothing to do with his law school assignments and everything to do with understanding what Marcus had shown him. The ratio, 70-30, silver to gold. He'd found it everywhere once he started looking. In Exodus 30, 23-24, the recipe for holy anointing oil, 50 shekels of myrrh, 250 of cinnamon, 250 of calamus, 500 of cassia. Total, 1,500 shekels. Ratio of primary to secondary ingredients, roughly 70-30. In the temple measurements in 1 Kings, the holy place was 40 cubits long. The most holy place was 20 cubits, 2-1, 66.33% to 33.33%. In the parable of the talents, one servant given 5, another 2, another 1, total 8. The productive servants turned their talents into 16 total. The ratio of servants who understood their calling versus those who didn't, 75-25%. Close enough. James saw the pattern repeating through Scripture, through ancient law, through the foundations of civilization itself. 70% could be measured, worked with, developed, improved. 30% was given, immutable, grace. The law covered the 70, the covenant covered the 30, and modern systems had forgotten the 30 entirely. They tried to make everything measurable, accountable, productive. They tried to eliminate the space for grace, for the unmeasurable, for the gold beneath the silver, and in doing so, they'd created systems that functioned perfectly but satisfied no one. James had tried to talk to his professors about it. They'd looked at him like he'd joined a cult. One had pulled him aside after class and suggested he was experiencing stress, recommended counseling services. But James couldn't unsee what he'd seen. He'd grown up in the church, AME, third generation. His grandfather had been a deacon, but he'd drifted away in college, found the whole enterprise too political, too hypocritical, too focused on respectability, and not enough on righteousness. Now he was seeing it differently, not as politics, but as economics, not as hypocrisy, but as the inevitable result of trying to run God's kingdom on silver principles when it required gold foundation. He'd reached out to Marcus again, met him for coffee, then dinner, then started helping Marcus with research, pulling legal codes and historical documents, tracking down obscure references. James didn't fully understand what Marcus was doing. Marcus was cagey about it, would only say he was bearing witness to something that needed to be on record. But James trusted him. There was something about Marcus that James had never encountered before, a certainty that didn't come from arrogance or ideology, but from direct experience, like someone who'd been to a country you'd only read about and could describe the landscape with casual accuracy, while you were still arguing about whether the country existed at all. "Do you ever think you might be crazy?" James asked one night as they sat in Marcus's tiny room, surrounded by papers and books. Marcus smiled. "Every day. But you keep going, because crazy is relative. To a society built on lies, truth looks insane. That's not comforting. Truth isn't supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be true." James had laughed despite himself. "You sound like a prophet." Marcus's expression had changed then, become distant. "I'm not a prophet. I'm just a man who prayed hard enough that God answered. That's all." "What did you pray for?" "Salvation," Marcus said quietly. "Not from prison, from myself, from the rage and the bitterness and the hate that was eating me alive. I prayed for God to save me from becoming the monster the system said I was. And he did, but not the way I expected. He didn't make the system better. He showed me the system was never meant to save anyone. That was never its purpose. The system measures and sorts and organizes, but salvation, redemption, that comes from somewhere else entirely." "From where?" Marcus had pointed to his chest. "From the 30% that silver can't touch, from the gold." Part 11. The First Tremor. The glitch was minor, so minor that at first no one noticed. A database query at a regional Social Security office returned an unexpected result. A record that should have been archived appeared in active status. The technician assumed it was a cache error, cleared it, moved on. But the record reappeared the next day, and the day after that. The technician escalated to her supervisor. The supervisor escalated to IT. IT ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong with the system. The record simply existed. It wasn't causing problems, wasn't corrupting data, wasn't interfering with normal operations. It was just there, appearing in searches when it shouldn't, marked with a status code that didn't exist in the official documentation. Accounted for. The IT team tried to trace the origin of the status code. They found references going back months, scattered across different databases, different systems, different agencies. Always the same code, always appearing near records that were complete, verified, properly documented, but somehow also finished in a way that normal records weren't, as if someone or something had marked them as resolved, in a sense that transcended mere administrative closure. The IT director sent a memo to the compliance office. "We have an anomaly, not a bug, not a hack, something else. Requires investigation. But investigation required budget, and personnel, and political will. And there were always more pressing concerns, so the memo was filed, pending review, indefinitely." Part 12. The Reading. Marcus lay in his bed in the rooming house, listening to the sounds of the city at night. Sirens, traffic, the couple upstairs arguing in Spanish, the television bleeding through the walls from the room next door. He had the document in his hand, his copy of what he'd filed. "In God we." 3 words that had cost him nothing to write, but everything to understand. He thought about the years in prison, the beatings, the solitude, the slow death of hope, and the slower rebirth of faith. He thought about his mother, dead at 40 from a cancer that could have been treated if she'd had insurance, if she'd had money, if she'd been counted as valuable by the silver system that measured her worth and productivity and found her wanting. He thought about the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Promises that had nothing to do with merit or achievement or worthiness. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Not if you're good enough, not if you work hard enough, not if you produce enough. Just, you will be. That was the covenant. That was the gold beneath the silver. That was what the system could never measure, and therefore tried to deny existed. Marcus closed his eyes and prayed the prayer he prayed every night. Father, I don't know why you chose me to see this. I'm not special. I'm not wise. I'm just a man who was broken enough to finally listen. But if this is your will, if you want this truth on record, then I trust you'll complete what you started. Not my will, but yours. And not my timing, but yours. Not my understanding, but yours. He paused. And God, thank you for counting me when nobody else did. Thank you for accounting for me when I couldn't account for myself. Whatever comes next, I'm ready. Peace settled over him like a blanket. Marcus tucked the document under his pillow and drifted into sleep. Outside, the city continued its endless circulation of silver, buying, selling, trading, accumulating, spending, measuring, counting. But deep in the public records office, in a file marked RF2024108847, 3 words waited patiently for the world to be ready to complete them. And in the systems that ran the world, the databases and ledgers and registries and archives, a status code was spreading, quiet and unstoppable, appearing beside the names of those who had been seen, acknowledged, counted in the only ledger that mattered. Accounted for. The first chapter of the story had been written. The rest would unfold in God's time, not man's. In gold's time, not silver's. In the economy of grace, not the economy of merit. The weight of words had been felt. The paper had been filed. The witness had been born. And somewhere in the spiritual realm that intersected with the physical in ways no system could track, a kingdom was beginning to descend. Not from above, not from within, from the hearts of those who chose to live righteously, even when righteousness had no silver value, from those who chose gold. Epilogue to Chapter 1. The Ratio Revealed. 67 days after Marcus filed his document, Janet Reeves stood before the Federal Reserve Committee with a proposal that would end her career. She'd spent those 67 days researching, calculating, modeling. She'd found the ratio everywhere, in economic history, in monetary theory, in the patterns of boom and bust that defined capitalism. 70% of the economy ran on silver principles, on circulation, exchange, productivity, measurable value. But 30%, the part that created actual wealth, actual satisfaction, actual human flourishing, ran on something else, on trust, relationships, creativity, beauty, love, sacrifice, service, on gold. And the modern economy, in its obsession with measuring everything, had tried to turn that 30% into silver, had tried to monetize relationships, financialize trust, commodify beauty, extract value from love. It was killing us, not dramatically, not overnight, but slowly, inexorably. The system was consuming the gold foundation it needed to function, replacing it with more silver, until everything circulated, but nothing held. "We need to acknowledge what we can't measure," Janet said to the stunned committee. "We need to leave space for the 30% that makes the 70% worth having. We need to stop trying to turn gold into silver and remember that gold's value is in being gold." The chairman's face was impassive. "Dr. Reeves, are you resigning your position?" "No, sir. I'm calling for the system to repent." The word landed like a bomb in the sterile conference room. "Repent?" someone repeated, incredulous. "From the Latin penitere, to feel regret, to change course, to acknowledge error and choose differently." Janet looked around the table. "We've built an economy on a foundation we're actively destroying. That's not sustainable. It's not moral, and it's not working. Repentance is the only rational response." "This is the Federal Reserve, not a church." "Maybe that's the problem," Janet said quietly. She was asked to step out while the committee conferred. She never went back in. By the time she returned to her office, her security clearance was revoked, and her resignation had been accepted for personal reasons. But Janet Reeves went home that night and slept better than she had in years, because she'd borne witness. She'd spoken truth in a place built on useful fictions. She'd chosen gold, and somewhere in a rooming house on the east side of the city, Marcus Ellison woke from a dream with tears on his face and knew, without knowing how he knew, that the seed had sprouted, that the witness was multiplying, that the 30% was beginning to remember itself, that God was counting, not in numbers, but in names, not in silver, but in gold.